I'd like to invite Dan Gordon and Richard Salomon to the stage.
Just before we start, I'd like to introduce Alexander. Where are you? Please stand up. Played Lazar Haller in the movie. Happens to be in New York. Thank you for coming.
And I'll do the same. If John Stanisi, who played Rokita on Broadway, can stand, and Maya can stand, who played Ida Haller, you should meet your husband who's up there, and Michael Parva, who directed the Broadway and off-Broadway show.
Thank you. It's really a family affair. Another round of applause for the film and the screenwriter. So Dan, both of us knew Irena, but you knew her much better. So you want to share a little more of your story with her over the years, and tell us, as part of that, what made her tick. I helped build, as it said at the beginning, at Illinois Holocaust Museum, and I believe greatly in rescuers who stand up when the world is silent, as she did, and act. But what made her tick, and what did you come to learn from her in her final years?
Just before that, I want to say two things. One, I want to correct Jeff on something. I was not the oldest reservist in the Israel Defense Forces. I was, however, the oldest soldier ever to qualify for the Givati Brigade, which is an elite infantry brigade. Thank you. I was 68 when I qualified for my Purple Beret, and the proudest day of my life. Second, this is a triple simcha tonight, because first I meet old friends from the theater, second the screening, obviously, and make new friends, and third the book, which I wrote, Irena's Vow, was published today, is available on Amazon, and I invite you to get a copy of the book and give it to your kids and grandkids and spread the word. It's a good book. It goes into a bit more detail than the movie can, which is typical of any book. So it's on Amazon, called Irena's Vow, and by me. Irene had, in Hebrew we say emunah shlema. She had perfect faith. She wasn't dogmatic in her religion. But I think of more than anyone I ever knew, she had absolutely perfect faith. There was a point in time, it's not in the movie, we didn't do that scene. Excuse me. She, at a certain point in time, obviously she's raised Catholic, she went to confession. And she confessed to the priest that she had become Rugemer's mistress. And he said, well, you have to end that. That's a sin. And she said, well, I can't. Everyone will be killed. And the priest said, I'm sorry, you have to be concerned about your immortal soul. And Irene said, thank you very much. And I don't need anybody from now on to be between me and God. God and I have our own relationship. And that faith, she actually said, God will not let any harm come to us because of this baby. And it wasn't a pro-abortion choice, anti-abortion. It had nothing to do with that. In Irene's mind, it literally was Hitler wasn't going to get another Jewish baby. And she was
a great line in the film.
Yeah,
no question.
She was so convinced. She said, God will not allow any harm to come to us because of this baby. And that faith was always there. The other thing that was always there was one of the most delightful senses of humor of anyone I ever met. And she said to me many times, she said, if it wasn't for the fact that we could have been killed at any moment, we'd have all been laughing. Because it was like a French farce. One door would open, another door would close. The Nazis were up, the Jews were down, the Jews were down, the Nazis were up. And she had, I won't say she was a talented liar, but she had an extraordinary ability to improvise on the truth. And it got them out of a lot of jams. But I'll give you an example of her humor. I used to enjoy taking her to, if I had a movie that was going to premiere or a play that was opening or anything like that, I'd send a limo for her. She lived in Loma Linda. And she would always get upset it's too expensive, and she loved it. And so I was taking her to an award ceremony or a opening of a play or something, or a movie, I don't remember which. Anyway, she was going to get dressed up, and I was going to send the car for her. And she said, Khonya, would you mind if I bring a friend with me? And I said, oh, Irene. She said, well, I have a new friend. He's not very tall. I said, well, you're not very tall either. She said, and he's very thin. I said, well, you know the old saying, you can't be too thin or too rich. She said, yes, and I think I can lean on him. I said, well, that's wonderful. She said, so may I bring him with me? And I said, yes, of course, lovely. So the limo pulls up to the event, and I open up the door, and there's Irene, but there's no one with her. And she steps out, and she has a cane, and she had broken her ankle. And she said, this is my new friend, Mr. Stick. And that was Irene. Just this delightful sense of humor. She was a hoot to be with. And I think that perfect faith and just the notion she would not be silent in the face of evil. She just wouldn't do it. And she wouldn't ignore it. And the other thing was, it was actually a very Jewish philosophy. You know, I once heard a rabbi say, God doesn't ask us to be Moses, but he asks us to be the best that we can be. She had a same take on that. She said, look, when I saw that baby killed, there was nothing I could have done. If I had tried to do something, I would have been killed. And so there was nothing to do. And that is when she made a vow to God that if it ever fell into her hands to save a life, she would. But she said, God doesn't ask us to do things we can't do. He asks us to do those things that we can do. And she did them.
And she was obviously tremendously courageous. The Talmud, as we know, teach to save one life is to save humanity. For the audience's background, in 1998, I was asked, we were living in Glencoe, Illinois, to have a Holocaust Remembrance Day, and I came to learn of Irena and her story and called her up and flew her out to Illinois, and we met my wife, who's here, Jackie, and I, and our kids, who are now in their 30s, all spent time with her, and I interviewed her on stage. But like so many rescuers, and I'm curious your view on this, she found what she did, although incredibly courageous and at great risk, nothing that remarkable. She believes, like most rescuers, that others, if put in the same position, would do the same thing. Sadly, as we know from history, that's not the case. Your reaction?
Yeah, that's true. And I think, you know, I shared this story today, and I don't share it often. She was extraordinarily wise. It was very hard-won wisdom. There's a scene that alludes to it. You know, obviously in a movie, you can only capture so much. When she got everybody out into the forest, she then hooked up with a partisan unit herself. And she fell in love with the leader of the partisan unit, who was a very handsome man. His name was Jan. It was, I think, the love of her life in many ways. And they were to be married. And on the day they were to be married, and she's in the forest at the partisans' camp, and she's put on her wedding dress, she got the news that he had just been killed in a German ambush. And my son was killed in a terrible car accident at the age of 22. And Irene found out about it. One of the first people somebody called her. They knew we were very close. And she showed up and she hugged me and she said, you know, everybody else had such empty words. They were well-meaning, but they were empty words. And she just said, there is tragedy in life, Khonya. And I thought, boy, that's the wisest thing I've ever, and it's like, yeah, there is. There's no, we don't, any of us get out of this thing clean, but it really is how you live your life in between those moments that mattered to her.
She said to me, it doesn't matter who we are, what we do is who we are.
Yes.
And that's one of the biggest I ever heard.
Yeah, that actually became our T-shirt in the Broadway show. Yeah, yeah. What we do is who we are. Yeah.
So speak a little to the fact that first generation of survivors is sadly passing on. The relevance and importance of the movie now, perhaps as more or even at least as much as any time.
More than ever. More than ever. You know, I was there when the movie was shot. I certainly was there when the play was produced. Now I look at these scenes of Jews being machine gunned, of Jews hiding in basements while bombs are falling and gunshot. I just lived through that. You know, that was Israel on October 7th. That was Israel, still is Israel right now. We really have returned to a time in which Jew hatred is not only acceptable, it's become virtuous in some circles. And it makes Irene's story all that more important. The movie is the movie. All movies are part of the toy department of life. They're movies. But Irene's story is extraordinarily important. And it has more relevance now than ever.
And it obviously needs to be passed on, whether it's through the movie, the earlier play, or your book. No question. So let us take a few questions here.
Can I just start with a question?
Here, we have a microphone for the recording.
I think it's really great for context, and Dan has a phenomenal way of expressing so much. It's been asked, even as I was standing and people going to the washroom, how much of this film is embellished? Is this real? Did this all actually happen, that they're singing songs in the basement while the Germans are singing songs upstairs, et cetera, et cetera? How much is this real?
So there's actually nothing embellished. If anything, there are things that were left out that you sit there and not just scratch your head, but you say, God had to have been watching out for these people, because this is insane that they were able to. There are choices that people make in making movies that maybe in retrospect they would make again. You know, maybe they should have put up blackout curtains over the little, air vents in the gazebo, and, that's a nitpicking thing. But yes, did they celebrate Hanukkah in the basement in whispers? Yes, they did.
That makes an important point because, for example, in our museum, you have people united in the latrine singing Jewish songs. And there was a film we brought here that Isaac helped bring here at the JCC, a wonderful film that I was involved in, that Resistance They Fought Back, about debunking the myth that Jews blithely went to like sheep to the slaughter. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to have those stories told too as part of the resistance.
Yeah, and the other thing was, yes, the Gestapo did come to search the house, and Irene actually barred the door and said, I work for the most important German major in Tarnopol, and if you want to come in, you have to get his permission. And Rugmer did show up and go, just batshit crazy that they were accusing him of hiding Jews, and later someone did try to blackmail them. I mean, all that stuff happened, and she was asked by Rugemer to put the blackmailer at ease, he said, if Rugemer shows up in his uniform, the blackmailer will be a little bit cautious. But if the housekeeper shows up with the money, she said, imagine this, I'm taking the money to pay the blackmailer who's telling the Gestapo that I'm hiding Jews, and I'm helping the Gestapo trap him. She said, and when they got him, she felt like shouting, and he's telling the truth. Don't beat him up. Don't kill him. Honestly, there is, if anything,
Stranger
things
than
are
fiction.
played down in this movie rather than embellished.
Indeed. Other questions?
Thank you.
Yes.
My question is about Irena and her links to the Polish resistance. It seems that even when she was in her first job and she overheard how that street's going to be overrun, somehow she got the message out.
Yeah.
And she wasn't even yet, based on what you're telling me, she hadn't even made her vow yet, so
Yes.
to speak.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate? Thank you.
She-
This was a great movie.
Thank you. To say she saved 12 Jews in the basement and one unborn baby who then is born in the forest is true, but it is not the extent of what she did. She numbers of times, because she spoke perfect German, and she did overhear, servants are invisible. So she overheard Rokita. Every time they said, we're going to hit this quarter, that quarter, she got the word out. And she saved hundreds of people, if not more than that. And she worked, as you rightly said, from the beginning, she did everything she could do to help save lives at great risk to herself. Someone else said, "Oh, Schultz couldn't have been like that." Schultz was like that. Schultz said, "I don't want to know," and under the table he helped her.
When she came to Chicago, she also, I remember it as if it was yesterday, even though it's 1998. She was so offended by what she witnessed that she had to take steps of her own, in her own power, and to her own God, to do whatever she could to help save some part of humanity.
Yeah, and she wasn't, when she came to the United States. Actually, I'll tell you, this story is more miraculous. Again, there's only so much you can put into a movie. So she was smuggled out of Poland into a DP camp in Germany, because the irony was her identity was Sophie Soferstein, a German Jew. So she was smuggled out of Poland, where she was in trouble, into a DP camp in Germany where she could be safe. And at that time, it was very difficult to get in the United States. She had no one to sponsor her, and you had to have someone to sponsor you. And she didn't know anyone in the United States. She believed her family was dead. And so where was she going to go? And her only friends were Jews. So she started learning Hebrew, and she was going to go to what was then Palestine. And she got very ill. I forget if she had typhus or tuberculosis, but she was quite sick for a good deal of time. And she missed her slot. And a representative of the UN High Commissioner on Refugees came to the camp. And, all the DP camps were actually run by Haganah officials. They were doing double duty. They were underground for Israel. And this guy said to the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, "Look, we've been lying to you. There's somebody in here who isn't a Jew. She has no right to be here. And she doesn't belong in Israel because there's going to be a war there. And if anybody has ever earned the right to live in peace, it's this woman." And so he told the UN High Commissioner Irene's story. And he called for Irene, and Irene came to meet the man, and she said, "Between the two of us, we spoke 7 languages, but not one in common." And so he said, "Well, I'll see what I can do." And about 3 weeks later, he had pulled the strings, and she comes to New York. She comes to New York. Again, she doesn't know anybody. She speaks fluent Yiddish. Her only friends are Jews. She goes to work in the garment district. And she's working in the garment district. Then 5 years later, they open up the UN building, right, the big UN building. And all the tourists want to go and see it, and she wanted to go see it also. So she went to the UN, and she went to the cafeteria, and it was crowded because everybody was going, the opening few months to look at the building with its beautiful architecture. And this tall, handsome man comes to her table and says, look, there's not another seat available in the cafeteria. Can I sit at your table? And she looked around, and there was no other seat available. And she said, no, go ahead. And he said, I know you from somewhere. And she thought, the guy's coming on to me. And she said, no, I don't think you do. Unless you work in the garment district. And he was the most goyish-looking guy in the world. There's no way he worked in the garment district. So he says, no, I have a very bad memory for names, but I never forget a face. He was the UN High Commissioner on Refugees, who had gotten her out of Germany into the United States. He was also a widower, and 3 months later they were married.
Really? There's a Yiddish word for that called bashert, meant to be.
Now, take it even farther. He got dementia. He had Alzheimer's disease towards the end of his life. And he did not have a good pension from the UN. And Irene, who had worked as an interior decorator and also real estate agent, certainly didn't have the money to be able to put him in any kind of a good facility. And I can't remember the name of the rabbi in the San Fernando Valley. He was a big-time rabbi in the San Fernando Valley. He said, now it's the Jewish people's turn to return the favor. And her husband was the only non-Jew in the Jewish home for the aged and lived out his life there in dignity and with loving care. And I went to the home with Irene numbers of times when Bill was at the end of his life. So, the story just keeps building on itself and building on itself.
Paying it forward, indeed. We have a question, I think, up here.
I think we have time for one more question or two.
I want to thank you for making the movie, first of all. It really was very...
See this fellow over here? That's Jeff Sackman. That's the one you thank.
Well, thank you.
His efforts to get this movie made, together with his partner, Barry Meyerowitz, are nothing less than heroic. They would not say no. Against all logic, everything that any smart producer, and he's a smart producer, would say is you're never going to make a dime on this, you're never going to be able to put together the financing. He would not give up. His efforts were absolutely heroic, and he got the film made.
Thank you. But my question is, there was no real time frame of how long they lived in the Bay. How long were they hidden?
Yeah, they were in there about 8 months.
8 months.
Yeah.
All right, one more question right here.
The microphone will be coming to you. Hold on.
With the slaughter on October 7th.
Hold on, Mike. A mic is sneaking up behind you.
It's for the recording.
Thank you. Since the slaughter of October 7th in Israel, I'm wondering if you feel with the exponential increase of anti-Semitism that this movie and your book would somehow enable a way or would combat the anti-Semitism by using it to educate people who are just so ignorant and hateful.
Amen. Yeah. Yeah.
Could you use it as a tool?
Yeah, yes, definitely. And I don't like the term anti-Semitism. It's Jew hatred, and like I say, it has become, in some circles, literally virtuous. And yes, I would ask each of you to be a shaliach. I would ask each of you to get the word out about the movie and get people to see it. And if you want to send the book to your grandkids to get them to go see the movie, buy the book, get them to go see it as well. Get the word out.
And with all due respect,
Yeah.
We have a question over here.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you all for coming. Dan, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Jeff, I want to thank, the actors and people who are here, and please get the word out on the film.
Rick,